Making content about criminals has always been a tough subject to wrap our heads around. On one hand, the stories are interesting and get a lot of attention from audiences. On the other, the victims and their families have a very reasonable objection to their trauma being put on display for profit. This debate has been reignited with the release of Netflix's Dahmer miniseries, and we'll be breaking it down in this video. Let's start with the facts before they get lost in the shuffle. What is this series exactly? Titled Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer Story, the 10-episode limited series dramatizes the crimes committed by one of America's most notorious serial killers. It stars Evan Peters as Dahmer himself, and it was created by Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan. And yes, that is indeed the American horror story Ryan Murphy, though you could argue that Jeffrey Dahmer was an American horror story. Murphy's goal with the series was to explore how Dahmer was able to commit all his murders and beyond without getting caught. That doesn't just mean it explores the techniques of being a serial killer, but it also takes a closer look at the lives of the victims and the societal failures that left them vulnerable to him. We have to admit that it's an interesting angle to go with the story in the right hands. Unfortunately, the guy from American Horror Story wasn't probably the best choice to tell a nuanced story about Jeffrey Dahmer. While Evan Peters has gotten praise for his performance as the killer, the show overall has gotten pretty mixed reviews. It has settled in at a 53% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, meaning that the show in itself could have been better. But that's not what the debate is about, is it? Now, the real question is if it's even ethical to make a series like this. Documentaries are one thing, since they're focused on relaying the facts as they exist and have an element of investigative journalism to them. Some documentaries can actually be a usual product of intense research. But Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer Story, is not a documentary. It's a dramatization. It is to Jeffrey Dahmer what Bohemian Rhapsody was to Queen. Using real-life horrors to scare an audience isn't a great thing to do. There's also the fact that in order to turn a real story into something that can work as a TV or movie narrative, you have to bend reality into a narrative arc. That's not so bad when it's, say, the story of Queen, but it's messed up when the story is about something that ruined the lives of people. Those people have been speaking out against the series. Rita Isbell, who lost her brother Errol Lindsay at 19 years old, famously tried to attack Dahmer in court. That moment is recreated in the series with an actress who resembles her so much that she felt like she was reliving the scene. It was an emotional and stressful moment, and Netflix hadn't even bothered to get her consent to do it, or at least give her a heads up. It's safe to say that Isbell is speaking on behalf of the other people who are living on after what they and their loved ones went through with Jeffrey Dahmer. You'd have a hard time arguing in Netflix's favor right now. Moving on, there is at least one argument to be made for this series. The intent with which a project is done should be considered when we're judging it. In some ways, the team behind Monster could say that their objective is the same as a documentary. They want to present the facts. Their way of doing it via a dramatized series might distort the facts a little, but between Monster and the millions of Dahmer documentaries out there, it's pretty clear which one will get more views. And there are things that audiences, especially in America, need to learn from the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer often targeted victims from minority groups, and institutional racism and homophobia in the police and courts had a lot to do with why he kept getting away with it. The moment where a police officer returned a teenage boy back to Dahmer is a harrowing example of police racism. The boy was from Laos, and those things need to be remembered. In fact, in some ways, Monster is an all cops are bad story, since it takes a very strong position that Dahmer's killing spree was very much a failure of the police. Since the US is reevaluating its relationship with the police, now might be a good time to revisit the case of Jeffrey Dahmer. To be fair though, that's the only way to justify the existence of this series, and Netflix hasn't done much to support the argument. Getting consent from people like Rita Isbell and compensating them would have been a good way to show the noble intentions of the series. Next, there's also the freedom of speech aspect, or should we say freedom of expression. When we say freedom of speech, of course the Constitution protects the very very existence of the show. Freedom of expression is a more ideological stance that no one should stand in the way of creating art. Monster doesn't look like the kind of thing we think of when we think of art, but it does technically count. Ryan Murphy has shown through interviews and the like that he does care about the work he's putting into Monster. Say what you will about it, but his execution here is way more tasteful and well done than anything you'd see in American Horror Story. For whatever it's worth, it's clear that he cares about the story and takes it seriously. Just because it won't be an Emmy contention doesn't mean that the series didn't deserve to be made. And despite its flaws, there will be an audience that watches it and enjoys it. Not in the usual way that we enjoy TV or movies, of course, but it'll satisfy their curiosity about the Jeffrey Dahmer story in a way that isn't exploitative or pandering. Now, let's look at a movie that got this right. On the list of America's worst serial killers, Jeffrey Dahmer shares the top spot with Ted Bundy. Now, a lot of movies have been made about Bundy, the most recent ones being extremely wicked, shockingly evil, vile, and the very long title. That movie flew under the radar to an extent, though there were jokes about Zac Efron playing Bundy. Joe Berlinger's film was an adaptation of The Phantom Prince, My Life with Ted Bundy, a memoir written by his girlfriend, Elizabeth Kendall. We'd say that, in many ways, this was a pretty decent way to tackle the work of making a serial killer movie. It takes the perspective of Kendall as she lives with a serial killer and catches glimpses of the carnage he's wreaking. The fact that she wrote a memoir shows she was willing to put her story out there. We also don't see Ted Bundy do the things he did, but Kendall's perspective was more than enough to highlight how wrong and destructive it was. While the movie focused less on the societal issues that enabled him, it's very good at showing the legal and justice problems that allowed him to keep slipping away. Using the perspective of someone connected to Dahmer or a victim with their permission might have been a better way to tell this story than by casting the man himself as a villain protagonist. And while this movie didn't review much better than Monster did, it also didn't attract a backlash from the families of Jeffrey's victims. Finally, here's our take on the whole situation. It does suck that Netflix didn't bother to check with the families of Dahmer's victims before featuring them in the series. Those families should have been part of the production if they wanted to be, possibly providing some valuable information or at least helping them steer clear of offending people. Behind the scenes issues aside though, it's important for people to understand that these things happened and to come to terms with how they happened. Consider this. There could be a Jeffrey Dahmer out there right now. You wouldn't know about it until that person was caught and brought on the news, but by then it would be too late for their victims. We as a society should examine these stories and work to reform our laws and government to fill in the gaps that these criminals fell through. It's a democracy, after all, and things won't change unless the electorate wants them to. Maybe not even then, but that's a different topic for a different video. But it isn't just about society. Jeffrey Dahmer and people like him may have been legally fit to stand trial, but no one is born evil, especially not that level of evil. We should also consider the things that happened to them and their families that made them into the kind of people they eventually became. Serial killers aren't just a failure of the police. They're failures of society in general. Coming to terms with them is important, so we can strengthen our societies against them. That's it for today's video. What's your take on the debate surrounding this series? Do you think art shouldn't be restrained by real-life issues, or do you think it's too disrespectful to his survivors? Let us know in the comment section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.